Some of you probably know that I'm kind of a big fan of retro computing and history of computing. So I thought today might be a good day to start with a computer history minute. And I am going to tie this to something. In the category of technical things that are sort of life skills for everybody now, I would say spreadsheets probably count. But it's easy to overlook that somebody had to invent that concept. There was a time when there were computers and there were no spreadsheets. And in fact, a former programmer turned Harvard Business School student was the one who got the idea for it when he was taking a course where he saw the instructor fill the board with a grid of different numbers. And every time one of the numbers changed, it would cause a ripple effect, having to recalculate the effect on all the other numbers. So, today, this is kind of what we think of as this is what a spreadsheet does. But this is right around the time when personal computers were starting to become available. Until that time, the idea of a computer that you could just have on your desk that was fully interactive, those were sort of revolutionary ideas in the mid-1970s. And it occurred to Dan Bricklin, this Harvard Business School student who was also an accomplished programmer, that this was a thing that personal computers could do. Personal computers were still not at all powerful compared to the kinds of computers that businesses or labs would have, but he thought they would be powerful enough to do this. And that it would be a good personal productivity tool because he was just getting tired of, with a calculator basically, manually grinding through propagating changes to numbers. So this is a program called VisiCalc. This was probably the world's first interactive spreadsheet in the way that we think of spreadsheets today. It was originally written to run on the Apple II, and that was largely because a business partner that Dan Bricklin sought out, thinking that this would actually be something people might want to pay for. His business partner had 2 or 3 different computers, but the one that happened to be available for loan at the time was an Apple II, and so sometimes it's a happy accident. And this is one of those programs that became a killer app. People were buying Apple II computers just to run VisiCalc, which stands for Visible Calculator. You can see that the original Apple II only had 40 characters per line. You could only do uppercase letters. So by today's standards, it was extremely primitive. But this became, a sort of platinum selling program. It's kind of interesting that, there's a couple of reasons that I sort of wanted to bring this up today. One of them is that this was actually a pretty good example of early prototyping. The first prototype of the program was actually written in BASIC, which at the time, it was the prominent high-level language on personal computers, but it was way too slow for a production version of this program. It would never have worked. But it was enough to do sort of a mock-up that did a few simple things and sort of get feedback and try it out on his friends and stuff like that. So he was really, in some sense, I think he was doing some of the same interactive iterative design that BDD calls for today. It was ultimately written in assembly language for the 6502, which was the microprocessor that powered the Apple II and sort of the first crop of early personal computers. And it was actually written using an emulator that ran on a mainframe at MIT, the Multics mainframe, which was the project many of whose ideas all had given birth to Unix a little bit earlier. So a lot of interesting strands weaving together. In an interview with Bob Frankston, who was the sort of co-programmer who did most of the heavy lifting of developing the real version, I thought it was interesting that he said one guiding principle was to always have working code. And so the idea was that there was always a working program and they could make a choice whether to include a new feature or not include it. But if the program always had working code, they sort of, as opposed to having a bunch of features that were in flight. And I think this resonates a lot with the way that Agile says that we should be aiming to do things now, which is it's always working, it's always in a deployable state, and if you have time or if you have the priority, the inclination, you can choose to add more features to it or not. He also talks about essentially the power of abstraction. Even though it was written in assembly language, he sort of created a bunch of macros, essentially sort of short functions in assembly language that allowed him to essentially express his code at a higher level of abstraction than if he was writing directly in assembly language. And also his comments about anything that might surprise someone reading the code was carefully documented. So again, I think it's revealing that he says, my assumption was that I would forget these key points myself. So, a lot of the threads that sort of came together in Agile, the idea that always have something that's working and leave yourself the opportunity to add features at a fine grain, be careful about the beauty of your code, make it sort of speak clearly in terms of its design, and anywhere that it doesn't speak clearly, make sure you document it for the benefit of whoever is coming after, even you in a few months. Take advantage of the power of higher levels of abstraction to be able to write more concise code that does more things. That's my computer history minute.